Good morning, everyone. There is a famous saying that clothing make the man. But the truth is that sometimes clothing make the man, and other times clothing fake the man. In this week's parsha, we come to the conclusion of the parsha. We arrive at the mitzvah of tzitzit. And the commandment is to look at the tzitzit and remember all the commandments of Hashem. And this mitzvah is so important that it made its way into the third paragraph of the Shema, that every morning and evening when we recite the Shema, we recite this section of the Torah with this particular mitzvah of wearing the tzitzit, because it symbolizes remembering all the commandments of Hashem. How does this mitzvah remind us of all the commandments of Hashem? So Rabbi tells us that the word tzitzit, if you add up the letters, they have a numerical value of 600, and then there's 5 knots and 8 strings. So 600 is tzitzit, plus the 5 knots and the 8 strings, the total is 613. But Rabbi Dr. Nachum Rabinovich points out an interesting contrast within the mitzvah of tzitzit. He says, first of all, it's the most important mitzvah because it reminds us of all the commandments of Hashem. On the other hand, it's actually a voluntary mitzvah. There's no obligation to wear tzitzit. The Torah says in the Shema, we recite it in the sixth parsha and in the Shema, that if you have a 4-cornered garment, you should put fringes on it. But if you don't have a 4-corner garment, you don't have to wear tzitzit. Now, obviously, we try to deliberately wear 4-cornered garments, because Maimonides says it's preferable to try to voluntarily perform the mitzvah. But technically, if you don't ever wear 4-cornered garments, you have no obligation to wear tzitzit. It's not like tefillin that you must put on your tefillin. The question is, if it's such an important commandment, why is there an obligation every day that you must put on tzitzit, not voluntary act? The second thing is that over the centuries, this mitzvah developed in 2 different ways. There's what's known as the talit katan and the talit gadol. There's the big talit that we wear when we come to prayers in the morning, and we wrap ourselves with the talit, and we actually say a special blessing, lisatef batzitzit, to wrap ourselves with the tzitzit. But there's also the undergarment that we wear, the tzitzit of the beged katan, the small tzitzit, underneath our shirt, which is concealed underneath our shirt. And that has a separate blessing in the morning. Asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav kimenes al mitzvat tefillin, on the mitzvah of tefillin. So, on tzitzit. So how did we end up with 2 different forms of this mitzvah? The personal, private tzitzit under your shirt, with a special blessing al mitzvat tzitzit, and the garment outside, litzatef batzitzit, to wrap ourselves in the tzitzit. And the answer is that there are 2 different dimensions to garments. There are garments that we wear because they're an expression of who we are, and then there are garments that we wear to make an impression of who we are. So take, for example, the robe that a judge wears, or the uniform that a policeman wears. They're meant to be worn to make a statement and to make an impression of who this person is. They're to speak to others about who this individual is. They're to communicate to others, this person's a judge, or a king, or a person in authority, like a policeman, or a fireman, or whatever the uniform may be. But then there's garments that we wear not to impress anyone else, but they're a natural expression of who we are. So sometimes we choose certain garments, like if we're doing certain activities. We're gardening, we wear certain garments. If we're exercising, we wear different garments. If we're a painter in a studio, we may wear different types of garments. It's not to make an impression, they're more of an expression of who we are. The same thing is true in Judaism. There's 2 dimensions in our relationship to Judaism. One is when we come to shul, we wrap ourselves in the talit. What's the message? God, I'm part of the Jewish people. I am striving to keep the 613 commandments. I'm part of a nation that all observes the same commandments. Don't judge me for who I am with my individual flaws. Look at what I'm aspiring to be and become. Here's my talit. This is what I strive for. But then there's the shirt, underneath the shirt that tzitzit, which represents our private, personal persona. God, you know who I am, not just on the outside. I may be able to impress other people as a religious Jew with my talit, but you know my inner struggles, my inner demons, my inner battles, my inner hardships, because you know my thoughts, you know my feelings, you know my heart. And therefore, God, I pray to you from within to help me become the person who can observe all the commandments from within, because it's an expression of who I am, not just because it's imposed on me from without. And tragically yesterday, the world lost a wonderful woman by the name of Kate Spade, a famous, internationally renowned designer. At the age of 55, committed suicide in her Park Avenue apartment. This is a woman whose company sold for over $2 billion. And to compound the tragedy of this mental illness and depression, which led to her tragic death, leaving behind a teenage daughter with a suicide note to her daughter saying it wasn't your fault, was what her sister said. And her sister said that this didn't come as a surprise, and that she begged her sister to get help. But her sister ultimately refused to get help. Why? Because she was afraid that if the world discovered what she was battling, it would harm her brand. Her brand of pocketbooks and fashion accessories was all about happy-go-lucky, cheerful, happy, very colorful. And she said, if they knew about my personal persona, it would damage the brand name of my company, which represents happiness and positive mental health and cheer and colors and joy. And here you see the struggle, the conflict, the contrast between the one extreme, a highly popular, successful brand name, which the whole world celebrated as a cheerful company, a company that represents joy, and the inner darkness and mental illness and tragedy of the inner persona. And every person has two personas. And the outer tzitzis and the inner tzitzis represents the two dimensions. Yes, we strive to be perfect, we strive to be righteous, we strive to be good, but God knows our inner struggles. And when we come to pray, we come with the outer talit and the inner talit. And we say to God, help me become what I want to become, because you know my inner self and what I'm striving to become. And this reminds us that when we see people, don't just be fooled by the facade. Always speak to people and dig deeper and understand what they're dealing with, because someone may be projecting one persona, but on the inside they may be telling a whole different story. Just to conclude with a story, this is the time of the year where graduations take place. There was a young lady who graduated from an Ivy League college, from medical school, and she was valedictorian. And her whole family came to the graduation, and these celebrations are thousands of people. And the parents were kvelling with nachas as their daughter went up and accepted the honor of valedictorian and gave the valedictorian speech. And she was up there and received her diploma and her honors. When the graduation was over, the family went with her to a local restaurant to celebrate. As they were walking with her in her cap and gown with this young woman who is now a doctor, and they're walking down the street to the restaurant to celebrate with family, and they pass a homeless man sitting on a cardboard box. And the homeless man looks up and says, "Julie, how are you?" And the young woman goes over and says, "How are you, Jack?" And they start talking in friendly rapport, and suddenly the poor man, the homeless guy, gets off his box and he says, "Are these your parents, Julie?" And she says, "Yeah, meet my father, meet my mother, meet my family members." And this beggar, this homeless man, looks at the father and says, "I want to tell you, you have the most wonderful daughter." He said, "I want you to know I sit here on this cardboard box every day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And thousands of students pass me on the way to classes every day. Most of them don't even look at me. A few of them throw a coin in my bucket. But your daughter always gives me a warm smile in the morning, a good smile in the evening, stops to say hello, asks me how my day is doing. Often she'll bring me half of her sandwich that she didn't eat at lunch. She'll bring it to me for dinner." He says, "You've raised such a wonderful, magnificent daughter." And when they walked away, the father turned to his daughter and said, "Julie, I want you to know something. When I stood in the graduation, I thought this was the proudest moment of my life. Watching my little girl graduate medical school with honors, top honors, valedictorian, receiving her diploma, making her speech. But I want you to know I got more joy and nachas listening to this homeless man. Because what I learned in the graduation hall is that I raised an accomplished, brilliant, successful daughter. But what I learned from this beggar is that I raised a kind, compassionate, caring daughter. What I learned in the graduation was the public persona of my daughter. What this man told me is the inner chambers of your character and your heart. Let us always remember the mitzvah of tzitzit and the two dimensions of life. And when we look within ourselves and we look within others, don't just judge people by the cover. Look within and read the book and realize that God knows our inner heart, and we should never lose hope and faith and optimism.